Thanks, Nikki. This week, we're going to look more closely at another one of the 7 principles of Indigenous community engagement, humility. And as always, we'll begin with a story to share our personal experience, reflection, and learning. Let me know when you're ready, Nikki.
We're good to go.
Okay. All right, so this is a photo from a fall gathering outside of Leaf Rapids, Manitoba that took place a couple of years ago now. There are a few younger community members in this shot who have become friends over the last 6 years, as well as Jan in the hoodie, who was part of our first program in Leaf Rapids in 2015, and Braden, the person with the bun on top of her head, who was part of our last pre-COVID program in 2019. I wanted to share this photo to serve as a contrast to the story that I'm about to tell you about our first year in Leaf Rapids. When community engaged learning started working in northern Manitoba, we were met with a lot of distrust due to the community's previous experiences with the university and colonial institutions. Imagine, if you will, our first day walking in through the main entrance of the big, airy town center that houses Leaf Rapids grocery store, cafe, and the K-12 school, amongst other things. There are several community members standing and sitting by the co-op, visiting and chatting, and their eyes zone in on us. Leaf Rapids is a small, mostly Indigenous community. So when a Chinese woman walks in with a bunch of university students, it's pretty obvious, and people will stare and kind of evaluate the situation. The faces do not seem to be friendly. No warm, welcoming smiles or friendly greetings, because we are in fact strangers. My predecessor, Jen Temmer, had prepared me for this, luckily, and had said, what you need to do is smile and say hi and get to know people. So that's what I did. I smiled, said hi to folks, introduced myself, and got to know them, and I tried my best to remember their names and stories for the next time I would see them. Of course, it wasn't as simple as that, but it was an important first step that I have prepared my students to engage in as well over the years, recognizing that it's our responsibility to take steps towards the community. This is something that Nigan Sinclair shared with us in his consultation. It's our responsibility to build trust and recognize that people may not have that trust for us right away. We can't expect the community to welcome us with open arms despite living, because of the lived experiences that they've had of harmful engagement with the university and the province. So during our first 5-week program in Leaf Rapids, community members directly questioned the point of the partnership and student program, how short a time we were spending in community, and what the benefits would be for the community. I remember first meeting one of the elders in the community, Jake. After learning that I wasn't in town for long, he said, only 10 days? What's even the point then? And to be honest, I didn't have an answer for him. I froze and I wasn't sure what to say. His daughter stepped in and spoke up on my behalf and razzed her dad for razzing me. But I didn't know what to say as a new person to the community and a new person in community engagement. The students shared with me that first year an experience they had after setting up a storytelling table in the town center as a way to get to know community members. They had baked some cookies and were inviting people to sit down for a visit. One woman came by the table and asked if they could speak Cree, which the group of non-Indigenous students had to admit was a language they did not know. And she replied, well, if you don't know Cree, then I can't tell you my story. And then she walked away. After introducing myself to another community member, including telling her about our volunteer work in the gardening program, with some probably note of like pride in my voice, she challenged me by saying, what are we going to get from that? That garden doesn't help the community. That's for the school division. This really showed me early on that the community was not a monolith and people would have very different understandings of who we were and whether they wanted the program in the first place. Rather than denying concerns or becoming defensive, it's important to listen to people, and show through our actions that our work will be different. Things are still not perfect in our Leaf Rapids partnership, but over time we've been able to build lasting relationships and show people that we weren't a flash in the pan. So that is a story about some of the initial challenges that we had, and the big teaching that helped to get us through that was humility. So we're gonna share with you over the presentation today different practices of humility that we heard from the consultation. So the first practice of humility that I want to share is that there is a need to cultivate resiliency and humility so that you can stay in relationship, even when you get called out. University partnerships come with a history of colonialism and are built on the exploitation of Indigenous peoples and land and other oppressed groups. As Mariano said, a Mapuche community member, the other who is not originario is always and already part of colonization. If you work for the government, a public institution, you are a colonizer. Indigenous communities therefore have good reason to distress us, to ignore our calls and emails, to take their time before opening up to us, to demand guarantees and to refuse to work with us. We need to recognize the risk that Indigenous communities are taking every time they collaborate with us and do the work of uncovering and addressing the harms that our institutions have caused and finding ways to heal and rebuild community members' relationships with ourselves and the institution. Demonstrating humility in our community engagement work will require showing that we understand why there is distress in the first place and that we are ready to respond to that distress with acknowledgement, patience, and gentleness. We need to see ourselves as learners who can listen and support the visions of Indigenous communities and are willing to challenge white supremacy and settler colonialism in ourselves and our institutions so that we can engage with Indigenous-led work, worldviews, and approaches. So how do we do this? The consultation showed overwhelmingly that listening is the first step. Listening was a skill strongly valued by the community and is necessary for working in good ways. We need to show the community that we know it is not our place to lead, but rather to listen and ask questions to ensure we know the best way to learn, work, and relate to our Indigenous partners and the community members. Listening is particularly important when it comes to identifying project goals and designing for community benefit. We need to listen to partners so that we can understand their vision and align our work with their community goals. Nati, one of the simpatizante of the Mapuche people, shared, usually when people approach communities and are new to this reality, they say, look, we should create a collective and create a program and do this project and put together an organization. And we just look at them like, okay, yeah, sure. We know where you're going with this. We've been down that road many times. When we fail to listen and co-design with community, we fall into patterns of paternalism and colonialism that impose external outcomes onto Indigenous communities, which often results in wasted resources, non-Indigenous priorities, and even direct harm. Here's a little comic strip we put together with some further examples of what it looks like when we are working in not so good ways, as Nikki likes to say. They didn't know much about working with communities, didn't connect with us, didn't understand the process. She thought herself superior, expected locals to jump when asked. He had money and figured this would solve everything. They knew all the answers and went ahead without consulting. They didn't listen. The next practice is to know how we can contribute, but to let the community determine our role. Community engaged learning practitioners and students typically position themselves as settler experts who are coming to serve underprivileged Indigenous communities. And I say that with air quotes. And as Nati noted to us, we think we can do these things because we've read a lot of books and know a lot of things. And she said a lot of people approach communities with that vision. Kekchi Maya community partner Christina Cox said, though, you're not here to come as experts. You're not coming to serve in the most colonial sense, the underprivileged. And Cree community partner Wally Chartrand reminds us going into fix is the wrong approach. Communities don't need universities to come save or serve them. We need to rethink the discourse of service that has become commonplace within Indigenous community engagement and challenge savior and charity mindsets that privilege settler knowledge and practices and diminish Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. In reality, Indigenous communities are the experts in community engaged learning, not only capable of finding solutions to their own challenges, but also the central teachers that we are asking to support the educational work of our institutions. We couldn't do our work without Indigenous communities, and so we need to recognize the knowledge, expertise, and contributions of our Indigenous community partners. Important to note, the expertise of Indigenous communities extends beyond limited settler understandings of what constitutes Indigenous knowledges. Usually people think of things like ceremony, hunting, trapping. Along with these important knowledges, Indigenous communities also hold expert knowledge in governance, education, ecology, sustainability, healthcare, and many other disciplines. Approaching our partners with humility means that we confront our settler arrogance and entitlement and come into partnerships ready to discuss and clarify the goals and needs of the community, how we can contribute, and how the community envisions our roles and responsibilities within their work. We should also be ready for those roles and responsibilities to change over time and as we work with different people, because we need to reflect the differences in history, cultures, and goals of the individuals and communities that we work with. So this is a photo of the kitchen at the Indigenous Family Center in Selkirk Avenue. Some of you may be familiar with it. Every Friday for almost a decade, people would be at this corner of Winnipeg for Meet Me at the Bell Tower. And it was there that I first learned about the importance of jumping in and doing what was needed, washing the dishes, mopping the floor, stacking chairs, and serving food to elders. We might come in as academics, as practitioners, but when we arrive, we should be community members. Darian Morton was also a UM graduate student who did his master's thesis with AO, Aboriginal Youth Opportunities, and he shared that he was asked by the youth partners to take on the administrative and bureaucratic work of their partnership. We need to be prepared to do the work the community asks us to do, whatever it is. The next practice is to teach only if we are invited. We need to know when our knowledge and expertise is wanted and should be shared with the community because they've asked us to. This means shifting from our usual role as teachers to that of learner and community member whenever we are in the community, and then only teaching and guiding if we are invited to do so by the community. Christina Koch, a Kekchi Maya partner, shared experiences of people coming to her community for community engaged learning and research. Rather than listening and learning from the community, some visitors assumed they had the expertise and wanted to be the ones to teach the community. For example, in one case, a researcher wanted to teach the farming community how to farm. That didn't work out so well. The practice of teaching only if we are invited comes with a responsibility to build upon the existing knowledges, skills, and ways of life of the community in a way that strengthens its self-determination, and to only teach when requested by the community using approaches and methods that the community prefers. An important note on capacity building is that Indigenous communities often become the targets or objects of capacity building initiatives, especially coming from universities and other non-Indigenous institutions. Before engaging in capacity building work, it's important to critically reflect on who is assumed to hold capacity and who will be the true beneficiaries of the capacity building. Too often, capacity building is code for building capacity for colonial ways of working that push the community in the direction of a capitalist settler society. For example, an Anishinaabe youth shared their critique about a university bridging program, calling the program an assimilation tactic to take kids from these communities to the city. The next practice is to know that we will need to learn and that we will need help. Part of knowing our place is acknowledging when and where we lack knowledge and experience and recognizing that we have much to learn from the community. We need to be humble about the scope, depth, and limits of our own knowledge and skills, be ready to learn and develop our capacity to work with Indigenous communities, and to create space for Indigenous expertise to lead and guide the work. We will need teachers and mentors in our work, and we should approach our partnerships ready for the mutual exchange of knowledge, experience, and resources that actually happens, and ensure that partnering communities receive comparable recognition for their contributions. Finally, we need to be humble about who did the work and why it could be done. Universities often have colonial frameworks for how we produce, claim, and share our work, which overemphasize the value of independent work and quick successes, while diminishing the importance of collective work and slower processes. Approaching community engaged learning with humility requires that we make explicit to students, administrators, and partnering communities that we play a small role and often will make a limited impact in the shared and intergenerational work of Indigenous healing, resurgence, and reclamation. We need to have humility about our impact, recognize the unseen labor, and share the credit for what is accomplished. This is a photo of a river in southern Toledo district in Belize. Early in the consultations, I was on a program trip in Belize and had the chance to sit down with Pablo Mis and Filiberto Panados to talk about assessment. When I questioned whether our 5-day program working with youth to celebrate and value Maya foods and food traditions was having any impact, Pablo was quick to remind me that we play a very small role in a much larger movement. He said that we are only one speck, one message that values Maya ways amongst a bombardment of other messages that value things like Coca-Cola. Rather than measuring whether our annual project was changing youth perspectives on Maya foods, literally 5 days in a community once a year, he said that we should instead measure the alignment of our project to the broader goals of the community and strive to be one of many small actions that moves community visions forward. Reflecting on what he said, I imagined the analogy of a speck in a river and thinking about how we are flowing. Are we flowing with the water? Are we a log that's sticking up and changing the water's movement? Are we a little pool off to the side, taking time away from the actual work? Or might we even be a dam stopping the river entirely? So those are the practices that we wanted to share with you today. And now we're going to move into a reflection section in breakout rooms to help us think about the teaching of humility from the community members that we've spoken to. And I have 2 questions here for the breakout rooms. So the first question is for folks who already have an Indigenous partnership or engagement. Who is making your project or partnership possible, and what roles do you play? And the second question is for folks who don't. You're not yet engaged with an Indigenous community. So we invite you to think about what people have told you about your gifts and growth points when it comes to community engagement or partnership with Indigenous communities. So I'm going to stop sharing. We'll copy those questions into the chat. And I think we're going to move into breakout rooms to explore those questions together.